The auction block stood in the town square like a weathered monument to desperation, and 19-year-old Tobias McCready was about to be bartered upon it, his fate hanging precariously in the balance. The morning sun, a harsh spotlight, illuminated the dust swirling around the onlookers, a motley crowd whose faces mirrored a morbid blend of cruel curiosity and thinly veiled greed. Some nervously fingered coins, while others simply sought a spectacle, eager to witness the public dismantling of a young man's dignity. Tobias, his hands bound tightly behind his back, felt the collective gaze of the crowd pierce his skin. His father's legacy of ruinous gambling debts had finally culminated in this grim tableau. The bank, unyielding in its calculations, had decreed that since Tobias possessed no monetary wealth, he would settle his debt with the most valuable commodity he owned: his freedom. 7 years of indentured servitude to the highest bidder, 7 years stolen from his life. The auctioneer, a corpulent figure named Clyde Rafferty, mopped his brow with a soiled handkerchief, his voice booming with calculated enthusiasm. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have before us a prime specimen, a strapping young lad with a strong back, sound teeth, and, yes, I'm told he's yet to taste the sweetness of a woman's kiss." The crowd erupted in a cacophony of coarse laughter and jeers. Tobias felt a burning shame crawl up his neck, but he resolutely kept his chin high. He refused to offer them the satisfaction of witnessing his collapse. "What am I bid for 7 years of this boy's devotion?" Rafferty bellowed, his eyes scanning the assembled faces. "He can work your fields, tend your livestock, repair your buildings, and for any lonely hearts in the vicinity." The disgusting laughter intensified, threatening to suffocate Tobias. He yearned to vanish into the very ground beneath his feet. A voice, gruff and impatient, echoed from the back of the crowd. 50. It was Samuel Boone, the blacksmith notorious for driving his apprentices to the brink of exhaustion. $60, retorted another voice, this one belonging to Margaret Tate, the proprietress of the local saloon, a woman whispered to be exceptionally harsh with her employees. As the bidding escalated, Tobias desperately searched the crowd, hoping to find a flicker of compassion, a hint of mercy. Instead, he encountered only avaricious eyes and predatory smiles. They didn't see him as a human being. He was merely 7 years of cheap labor, or worse, a plaything for their depraved amusement. The numbers climbed relentlessly, 70, 80, 90, each bid hammered into Tobias like a nail being driven into his coffin. He thought of his father, now moldering in an unmarked grave, a victim of his own self-destruction, leaving behind nothing but a mountain of debt and an inheritance of shame. He thought of his mother, gone since he was 12, who would have been devastated to witness her son's degradation on this ignominious block. $100! The voice, sharp and commanding, sliced through the air, sending a shiver of dread down Tobias's spine. It belonged to Magnus Grundy, a cattle rancher with hands the size of hams and a reputation for brutal violence. Grundy leered at Tobias, exposing a row of yellowed teeth, and the young man knew, with chilling certainty, the kind of unspeakable hell that awaited him on that remote ranch. The crowd fell into a hushed silence. $100 was more money than most of them possessed, or even saw in months. Rafferty, his face glistening with sweat, raised his gavel, poised to seal Tobias's dreadful destiny. Going once for $100 to Mr. Grundy. That's when she spoke. $200. The voice, calm and clear, yet resonating with an undeniable strength, emanated from the periphery of the crowd, like the pure, unspoiled water of a mountain spring. Every head swiveled in unison, including Tobias's. Through the sea of faces, he saw her, a woman dressed in simple, practical brown attire and well-worn boots, standing apart from the throng as if she held dominion over the very ground upon which she stood. What followed would irrevocably alter Tobias's understanding of mercy, of second chances, and of the enigmatic woman who had just rescued him from a fate that was, in many ways, worse than death itself. Martha Caldwell stood at the edge of that throng like a stoic monument against a rising storm. $200, a sum that represented a small fortune in a place like Deadwood Junction. The silence became so palpable that the slightest whisper could be heard across the square. Rafferty's gavel remained suspended mid-air, his mouth agape like a fish pulled from the water. Magnus Grundy's face flushed crimson, his eyes darting back and forth between Martha and the young man on the platform, a silent rage simmering within him. "Now just hold your horses," Grundy growled, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the dirt. A woman like her has no business bidding on a strong, able-bodied man like that. Martha stepped forward, her boots striking against the wooden planks with a resolute click as she moved purposefully through the crowd. People parted before her like the Red Sea, some motivated by respect, others by sheer, unadulterated fear. Everyone in town knew Martha Caldwell. She had carved her cattle ranch out of the unforgiving wilderness after her husband's untimely death, and she suffered no fools. "My money is as good as yours, Magnus," she stated, her voice unwavering. "In fact, it's better considering I actually have it." A ripple of murmurs spread through the crowd. It was common knowledge that Grundy was perpetually behind on his payments, always promising recompense next month. Tobias watched this woman approach the platform, his mind racing as he attempted to decipher her motives. She possessed steel gray hair pulled back in a severe bun and deep lines etched around her eyes, a testament to years of hardship and difficult decisions. But there was something else there, something he couldn't quite discern. Her eyes lacked the voracious hunger of the others. They were not cruel or calculating. Rafferty cleared his throat, sweat now cascading down his face. "Well, Mrs. Caldwell, that's quite a generous offer, but perhaps you should contemplate what you're getting yourself into. This boy has 7 years of labor to offer, which is a significant commitment for a woman running a ranch all alone." "Are you questioning my capacity to manage my own affairs, Clyde?" Martha's voice dropped to a near whisper, yet it cut through the air like a honed blade. Rafferty visibly recoiled. "No, ma'am, not at all. I merely thought—" She reached into her coat and produced a leather pouch, heavy with the clinking weight of coins. The metallic sound it emitted as she shook it effectively silenced any remaining objections. $200 in cash. Are there any other bids?" The crowd glanced around nervously. $200 represented more income than most of them earned in an entire year. Grundy's face had turned a shade of purple, but he recognized when he had been defeated. He spat again, then stalked away, muttering curses under his breath. "Going once," Rafferty announced weakly. "Going twice." He looked around desperately, hoping someone else would intervene, but the silence held. "Sold to Mrs. Martha Caldwell for $200. The gavel fell with a sharp crack that echoed through Tobias's very bones. In that moment, his destiny was sealed. However, rather than the crushing despair he had anticipated, he experienced an unfamiliar sensation: relief. This woman had saved him from Magnus Grundy's brutal ranch. But why? What did she intend to do with him? Martha counted out the money with meticulous precision, placing each coin into Rafferty's clammy hand. The crowd began to disperse, disappointed that their spectacle had concluded. Some cast curious glances at Martha and Tobias, already laying the foundation for the gossip that would undoubtedly spread through the town like wildfire. When the transaction was complete, Martha approached Tobias. Up close, he could discern the intricate network of lines etched on her face, the calluses on her hands, and the unwavering strength in her posture, betraying someone who had fought relentlessly for everything she possessed. She scrutinized him, not as if she was examining property, but as if she was attempting to glimpse into his very soul. "Can you ride?" she asked simply. "Yes, ma'am," Tobias replied, his voice hoarse from the morning's ordeal. "Good. We have a long journey ahead of us." She turned toward a horse and wagon waiting at the edge of the square. Then she paused, looking back at him with eyes that were impossible to read. "And boy, whatever you think you know about why I bought you, you're wrong." As they walked toward her wagon, Tobias couldn't escape the feeling that he had simply exchanged one enigma for another. And deep within his gut, he sensed that Martha Caldwell harbored secrets that ran deeper than any mine shaft. The wagon wheels groaned against the rocky terrain as they left Deadwood Junction behind. Tobias sat beside Martha on the worn wooden bench, his wrists still chafed from the ropes that had bound him at the auction. The morning sun climbed higher, casting stark shadows across the arid landscape that stretched endlessly before them. Martha hadn't uttered a single word since they had departed from town. She maintained her gaze fixed on the trail ahead, her weathered hands gripping the reins with unwavering firmness. The silence between them felt as heavy as the oppressive desert heat pressing down on their shoulders. Tobias stole furtive glances at her, attempting to understand what kind of woman would pay $200 for a stranger. After an hour of nothing but the creaking of wheels and the rhythmic thud of horse hooves, Tobias finally broke the silence. "Ma'am, if you don't mind me asking, why did you bid on me?" His voice emerged smaller than he had intended, like that of a child asking why the sky was blue. Martha's jaw tightened imperceptibly, but she didn't turn to look at him. "You have questions, boy. That's only natural. But some answers carry a higher price than others. For now, all you need to know is that you're not going to Magnus Grundy's ranch, and that's a blessing you should count." "But $200, Tobias persisted. "That's more money than most people see in their entire lives. You could have bought 5 horses or cattle, or I could have let that animal Grundy work you to death in his mines." Her voice lashed out like a whip. "Do you think I don't know what he does to the boys who work for him? Do you think the whole town doesn't whisper about the ones who go to his ranch and never come back?" A chill ran down Tobias's spine despite the oppressive heat. He had heard the rumors about Grundy's ranch, dark stories told in hushed tones, boys who disappeared without a trace, accidents that were anything but accidental, workers who attempted to escape and were found weeks later, their bodies mangled beyond recognition, if they were found at all. "So you saved me," Tobias said quietly. "But why? You don't even know me." For the first time since they had left town, Martha turned to face him. Her gray eyes held an emotion that made his chest constrict. Not kindness exactly, but not cruelty either. Something deeper, something that resembled a haunting ancient pain. "7 years is a long time," she said finally. "Long enough for a boy to become a man if he's willing to work for it. My ranch needs strong hands, and you need a place where you won't end up dead before you reach the age of 25. The wagon hit a deep rut in the road, jarring them both. Martha surveyed the horses with practiced ease, but Tobias noticed the tension in her hands, how her knuckles had gone white as she gripped the reins. She was apprehensive about something, although she was trying desperately to conceal it. "What kind of work?" he asked. "Cattle, fence repair, building, whatever needs doing." She paused, seeming to carefully consider her next words. "And perhaps if you prove yourself worthy of trust, I'll teach you things that will serve you well long after your 7 years are up." "What kind of things?" Martha smiled for the first time since he had met her, but it wasn't a joyful expression. It was the kind of smile someone might wear when contemplating ghosts. How to survive in a world that wants to grind you up and spit you out? How to stand your ground when everything is falling apart around you? They crested a hill, and in the distance, Tobias saw it. A ranch house nestled in a verdant valley, a wooden fortress amidst the harsh desert landscape. Lush green pastures fed by underground springs surrounded the buildings, an almost unbelievable sight in this arid region. Cattle dotted the fields like scattered black and brown seeds. "That's home," Martha said simply. But as they descended toward the ranch, Tobias couldn't shake the pervasive feeling that Martha Caldwell was concealing something terrible. Something that explained why a successful rancher would pay a small fortune for a boy she had never met, and why she kept looking at him as if she was gazing at a ghost. The Caldwell Ranch unfolded before them, an oasis of verdant life amidst the harsh landscape. Expansive pastures nourished by hidden underground springs, sturdy barns that looked capable of withstanding any storm, and a 2-story house that hinted at prosperity forged through relentless labor and sacrifice. But as the wagon passed through the main gate, Tobias noticed something that sent a primal shiver down his spine. The ranch possessed an unsettling stillness, an unnatural emptiness. No ranch hands toiling in the fields, no voices echoing morning greetings. Only silence and the rhythmic clatter of the wagon wheels on the packed earth. For a ranch of this magnitude, there should have been at least a dozen men working. Instead, it felt like a ghost town, abandoned to the vagaries of time and weather. Martha brought the wagon to a halt near the house and dismounted without a word. Tobias followed suit, his legs stiff from the arduous journey. The wooden porch groaned beneath their weight as she led him to the front door, but she paused before touching the handle. "Before we go inside," she said, her voice hardening, "we need to get something straight. This ranch operates on respect and unrelenting work ethic. You do your share, you'll be treated fairly. You slack off, cause problems, or try to escape." She turned to face him. her gray eyes now as cold and unforgiving as winter stone. "Well, let's just say that Magnus Grundy won't be the worst thing that ever happens to you." Tobias nodded, his mouth suddenly parched. "Yes, ma'am." "Good." She opened the door and gestured for him to enter. "Your room is upstairs, second door on the right. Get yourself cleaned up and meet me in the kitchen in 10 minutes. We have work to do." The interior of the house was as impressive as its exterior. Polished hardwood floors, finely crafted furniture that looked like it had been imported from the east, and large windows that allowed streams of golden sunlight to flood the rooms. But as Tobias ascended the stairs, he noticed something else. Portraits lined the hallway, but in every single one, the faces had been brutally defaced, scratched out with some sharp implement, leaving deep gouges in the canvas where eyes and mouths should have been. His assigned room was simple yet immaculate. A bed, a washstand, and a small window overlooking the sprawling pastures. He splashed water on his face, desperately attempting to make sense of the circumstances in which he found himself. A wealthy widow living alone on a ranch that required a sizable workforce, yet seemed to employ none. Vandalized family portraits, and those haunting eyes that seemed to perceive him as someone else entirely. 10 minutes later, he found Martha in the kitchen, tending to a pot of coffee that smelled like paradise itself. She had changed out of her auction attire into practical work pants and a simple cotton shirt. Her hair was partially undone, making her appear noticeably younger, almost vulnerable. "Sit," she commanded, pouring him a steaming cup of coffee. "We need to discuss expectations." Tobias sat at the wooden table, wrapping his hands around the warm mug. The coffee was the most delicious thing he had ever tasted, rich and strong enough to resurrect the dead. "Ma'am, if you don't mind me asking, where are all your ranch hands?" Martha's face darkened. "I work alone, have for the past 3 years. I've found that hired help tends to create more problems than they solve. But a ranch this size, it's my right to manage it as I see fit." Her voice cut off his objection like a sharp knife. "Your job is to follow my instructions without question whenever I issue them, starting now." She walked to the window and pointed toward a distant field where a section of fence had collapsed. "That fence needs to be repaired before nightfall. Posts, rails, wire, everything is in the barn, including the tools. I expect it to be done correctly the first time." Tobias glanced at the fallen fence, then back at Martha. The task would require 3 men a full day to complete properly. "Ma'am, that's a lot of work for one person to... Are you telling me you can't handle it?" The challenge in her voice was unmistakable. "No, ma'am. I'm just suggesting that it might take longer than you'd better get started." She turned away, dismissing him as if he were nothing more than another tool to be used. "Lunch is served at noon. Supper is at 6. If you miss either one, you'll go hungry until the next meal." As Tobias made his way to the barn, his mind was flooded with questions. Why was she testing him so rigorously? What had happened to the other workers? And why did she persist in looking at him with those haunted eyes? However, it was the mutilated portraits that disturbed him the most. Someone had meticulously scratched out every face in those family pictures, carving deep enough to inflict irreparable damage to the canvas. The question was, had Martha perpetrated this act herself, or was there someone else residing on this ranch? Someone she didn't want him to know about? The fence work nearly broke him. By noon, Tobias's hands were raw and bleeding. His back screamed in protest with every movement, and sweat poured down his face like a torrential downpour. But he persevered, driven by a force stronger than fear, a desperate need to prove that he was worth more than the price Martha had paid for him. When the dinner bell rang, he had managed to replace 4 fence posts and string new wire between them. It wasn't the entire job, but it was more than any reasonable person could expect from one man in half a day. He stumbled toward the house, every muscle in his body screaming in pain. Martha was waiting on the porch, her arms crossed, watching him approach. Her expression was unreadable, but he sensed a hint of approval flickering in her eyes. "Wash up," she said simply. "The food is getting cold." The meal was far superior to anything he had consumed in months. A hearty beef stew with garden vegetables, freshly baked bread that was still warm from the oven, and more of that incredible coffee. They ate in silence for several minutes before Martha finally spoke. "You did well out there, better than I expected." "Thank you, ma'am." Tobias paused, gathering the courage to ask the question that had been tormenting him all morning. Ma'am, could I ask you something personal? Martha's spoon stopped its journey halfway to her mouth. That depends on what it is. Those pictures in the hallway, the ones with the faces scratched out, what happened to them? The ensuing silence was so profound that Tobias could hear the frantic thumping of his own heart. Martha set down her spoon and stared at him, her gray eyes filled with a sorrow that mirrored ancient, unhealed wounds. You're a curious boy, aren't you? Her voice was barely above a whisper. I'm sorry, ma'am, I didn't mean to pry. No. She stood abruptly and walked to the window, turning her back to him. No, you have a right to know. If you're going to reside here for 7 years, you deserve to understand what kind of house this is. She remained silent for so long that Tobias began to believe she had changed her mind. When she finally spoke, her voice was as hollow as the echo from a deep cave. Those pictures were of my family, my husband and my son. She turned back to face him, and Tobias saw unshed tears shimmering in her eyes. They died 3 years ago in a tragic accident. A spooked horse near a treacherous cliff trail. I'm sorry, Tobias said sincerely. I destroyed those pictures because I could no longer bear to look at them. I couldn't stand the way they smiled at me from those frames, as if they were mocking me for remaining alive when they weren't. Her hands clenched into tight fists at her sides. My boy was 19, the same age as you. Her words struck Tobias like a physical blow. Suddenly, everything clicked into place. Why she had bid on him, why she had paid such a high price, and why she regarded him as if he were a spectral apparition. He wasn't simply a ranch hand to her. He was a surrogate for the son she had lost. That's why you bought me, he said quietly. Because I remind you of him. Martha's composure finally cracked and a single tear escaped, tracing a path down her weathered cheek. His name was Daniel, Danny. He had your eyes, your build, and that same stubborn set to his jaw whenever he was determined to prove something. The realization settled on Tobias's shoulders like a suffocating weight. He wasn't simply working off his father's debts. He was being asked to live as a substitute for a dead boy, attempting to fill a void that could never truly be filled. If you were Tobias, what would you do? Stay and offer this broken woman the solace she desperately needed, knowing you would be living a lie, or leave and condemn her to confront her grief alone? What Tobias decided next would determine whether Martha Caldwell found peace or surrendered entirely to the ghosts that haunted this ranch. Tobias sat in stunned silence, watching Martha as she wiped away that solitary tear. The kitchen seemed to shrink, becoming suffocating with the weight of her confession. He understood now the pervasive emptiness of the ranch, why she lived as a recluse, and why she had spent $200 on a stranger who resembled her deceased son. Ma'am, he said carefully, I can't be him. I can't be Danny. I know that. Her voice sharpened, laced with defensiveness. Do you think I'm some senile old woman deluded by grief? I know exactly who you are, Tobias McCready. You're a young man with no family, no money, and no future, just like Danny was before I took him in and raised him to be something better. She moved back to the table and sat across from him, her composure largely regained, although Tobias observed the slight tremor in her hands as she reached for her coffee cup. The difference is, she continued, you've experienced something Danny never had. You've seen the depths. You've stood on that auction block and felt the humiliation of having your life put up for sale. That kind of experience either breaks a man or forges him into something stronger than steel. And what if it broke me? Martha scrutinized his face. Then you wouldn't have labored all morning on that fence without complaint. You wouldn't have inquired about my family instead of simply keeping your head down and serving out your time. Broken men are indifferent to the suffering of others. Outside, the afternoon sun began its descent. Tobias knew he should return to the fence work, but something in Martha's eyes indicated that this conversation was not over. There was more she needed to express, more she needed him to comprehend. Danny was a good boy, she said softly. Intelligent, hardworking, compassionate towards animals, and respectful of his elders. But he was also sheltered, coddled. He never had to fight for anything because his father and I made sure he never lacked anything. That doesn't sound like a bad thing. It wasn't until it led to his death. Martha's voice turned bitter. He was riding the East Trail, checking on stray cattle. A routine chore, one he'd done countless times. But when his horse was startled by a rattlesnake, Danny didn't possess the skills to control it. A more seasoned rider, someone who'd faced actual danger, might have remained in the saddle. But Danny, she shook her head. Danny plunged over the cliff with that horse and died instantly. The pain in her voice was so raw that Tobias felt it resonate within his own chest. He wanted to offer comfort, but what words could possibly mend a wound so profound? I blamed myself for months, Martha confessed. I convinced myself that if I'd been a different kind of mother, if I'd exposed him to hardship and allowed him to learn to cope with adversity, maybe he'd still be alive. Maybe he would have been strong enough to survive. You can't know that. No, I can't. But I can endeavor to ensure that the same fate doesn't befall you. She leaned forward, her gray eyes filled with an unsettling intensity. 7 years, Tobias. 7 years to mold you into the kind of man who can endure whatever life throws at him. The kind of man Danny should have been. Tobias felt the weight of her expectations pressing down on him. She wasn't merely offering him employment. She was offering him the opportunity to transform himself, to transcend the frightened boy who had stood on that auction block. But the price of that transformation was living as a constant reminder of her most devastating loss. "And what happens after 7 years?" he asked. "After 7 years, you're free to go wherever you wish, to do whatever you choose. But you'll leave as a man who understands his own worth, not as a boy running from his father's mistakes." Thunder rumbled in the distance, and through the window, Tobias saw ominous clouds gathering on the horizon. A storm was approaching, and something deep inside him warned that it was going to be a violent one. "There's something else," Martha said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "Something I haven't told you about this place, about why I truly live alone." The way she spoke sent a jolt of fear through Tobias. Whatever she was about to reveal, it would undoubtedly alter his perception of Martha Caldwell and the ranch that was now his prison. And as the first raindrops began to splatter against the windows, he realized that some secrets were shrouded in darkness, far more sinister than others. The rain lashed against the kitchen windows, sounding like angry fists pounding on the glass. Martha's words hung in the air between them, heavy and foreboding. Tobias could feel his heart hammering in his chest, and a deep sense of unease settled in his stomach. He had a strong premonition that he wouldn't like what he was about to hear. "The reason I live alone," Martha began, her voice barely audible above the roar of the storm, "isn't simply because I prefer my own company. It's because the last 3 ranch hands I hired, they didn't exactly work out." "What do you mean they didn't work out?" Martha rose from the table and walked to a cabinet in the corner of the kitchen. She opened it and retrieved a bottle of whiskey, pouring herself a generous amount. Her hands were trembling. The first one was the man named Carter Willis. A big fellow, strong as an ox, came with excellent references from a ranch up north. He lasted 2 weeks. She took a sip of whiskey and grimaced. They found him one morning in the barn, beaten to death with his own shovel. Tobias felt the blood drain from his face. "Beaten to death? By who?" "That's what I asked the sheriff. That's what I've been asking myself every night for the past 3 years. Martha's eyes took on a distant look, as if she was reliving a horrific nightmare. There was no sign of robbery, nothing was missing, just a decent man murdered for no apparent reason. A thunderclap shook the house, making both of them jump. Lightning illuminated the kitchen in stark white flashes, casting grotesque shadows on the walls. The second man was named Pete Jameson, a younger guy, probably around your age. He worked here for about a month when it happened. Martha took another drink, a larger one this time. They found him at the bottom of the well. The sheriff said he must have fallen while drawing water, but Pete was a careful man, too careful to fall into a well. "And the third?" Tobias asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Marcus Reed lasted the longest, almost 3 months. I started to think maybe the deaths of the others had just been bad luck. Coincidence." She laughed, but the sound was devoid of any humor. "Then one night, I heard screaming coming from the bunkhouse. By the time I got there with my rifle, Marcus was gone. He had vanished into thin air." Tobias's mouth was completely dry. "Did they ever find him?" 3 days later, or what was left of him. Martha's voice was almost inaudible now. "The animals had gotten to him. The sheriff said he must have been dragged for miles. The rocks, thorns, and cactus had left him scraped raw all the way down to the bone in some places." The implications of what she was telling him crashed over Tobias like a tidal wave. 3 men dead. 3 unexplained deaths on the ranch where he was now living. and where he was contractually bound to work for the next 7 years. "Ma'am," he said slowly, "are you telling me that there's someone out there, someone who's been killing your workers?" Martha met his gaze. The look in her eyes chilled him to the bone. "I don't know what's out there, Tobias. I wish I did. All I know is that good men keep dying on my land, and I don't know why." Suddenly, the lights flickered and died, plunging the kitchen into darkness. Martha cursed and groped for a box of matches on the counter. A moment later, the room was illuminated by the flickering glow of a single candle. "Then why did you bring me here?" he asked. "Why put me in danger?" "Maybe because you're different. Maybe you're strong enough to survive it, whatever it is." She finished her whiskey in one gulp. "Or maybe I'm just a foolish old woman who can't stand to be alone anymore." Then, a sound came from outside. A low, keening wail that didn't sound quite human. It could have been the wind, but the terrified look on Martha's face told Tobias it wasn't. "What was that?" he whispered. Martha was already heading towards the rifle rack by the door. "That," she said, pulling down a lever-action Winchester, "is why we lock the doors at night, and why you'll be sleeping in the house instead of the bunkhouse." Another wail echoed across the ranch, closer this time. Through the noise of the rain and thunder, Tobias could hear something else. The sound of footsteps on the wooden porch. Someone was out there. Someone who had been waiting for him to arrive. The footsteps stopped directly outside the kitchen door. Martha gripped her rifle, her knuckles white, and Tobias could hear his own heart thundering in his ears. The silence stretched between the thunderclaps, heavy with dread. Then came the knock. 3 deliberate raps on the wooden door. "Mrs. Caldwell?" The voice was rough and weathered, but undeniably human. "It's Sheriff Briggs. Open up, please." Martha's shoulders sagged with relief, but she didn't lower the rifle. "How do I know it's really you, Sheriff?" "Because I'm standing in a goddamn thunderstorm asking nicely instead of kicking down your door. Now let me in before I drown out here." Martha unlocked the door and pulled it open. Sheriff Briggs stepped inside, water streaming from his hat and coat. He was a lean man with gray hair and weary eyes that had seen too much. His gaze immediately fell on Tobias. "So this is the boy from the auction," Briggs said, removing his hat and shaking off the rain. "Heard you paid quite a premium for him, Martha." "My business is my own, Sheriff." Martha's voice was flat. "What brings you out here in weather like this?" Briggs looked from Martha to Tobias. He seemed to be choosing his words carefully. "Found something today, something I think you both need to see." He reached into his coat and removed a leather satchel. It was worn, stained with age. "Recognize this?" Martha's face paled. "That's Danny's. He had it with him the day he—" She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. "They found it this morning in a cave a couple of miles from where Danny died, along with some other things." Briggs opened the satchel and took out several items. A gold pocket watch, a silver ring, and what looked like torn pieces of clothing. These belonged to Carter Willis, Pete Jameson, and Marcus Reed. The kitchen fell silent. The only sound was the pounding rain. Tobias felt bile rising in his throat. The implications were clear. "Someone's been collecting trophies," Briggs continued. "Someone who's been killing on this ranch for 3 years. I think I know who that is." Martha's rifle clattered to the floor. "No! Danny died in an accident. His horse spooked. He fell." "Martha," Briggs said gently, "Danny didn't die in any accident. He didn't die 3 years ago." The room began to spin. Tobias grabbed the back of a chair to steady himself as Martha stared at the sheriff in disbelief. "That's impossible! I buried my son! I saw the body!" "You buried a son, Martha, but that body was too far gone to identify. The sheriff figured you were too grief-stricken to look too close." Briggs reached into his coat and pulled out one last item, a recent photograph. "This was taken yesterday in Tombstone. Recognize him?" Martha took the photo with trembling hands. It was a young man, wild-eyed, long hair, but it was Danny. Older, harder, but still Danny. "He's been living out in the desert, Sheriff, living like an animal. He's been coming back here at night and killing your hired help." "But why?" Martha asked. Briggs sighed. "Some men break. They break bad." "I'm afraid that Danny Caldwell is beyond help." Tobias found his voice. "And now I'm here." Briggs nodded grimly. "And now you're here. He'll be coming for you soon." The sheriff paused, his voice grave. "The storm will give him cover. We're going to have to defend ourselves." As if summoned by the sheriff's words, that inhuman wail echoed across the ranch again. This time, It was closer than before. This time, Tobias could make out the cry of a man gone mad with the bloodlust. "What do we do?" Martha whispered. Briggs checked his sidearm and looked toward the windows. "We wait, and when Danny comes home, we do what should have been done a long time ago." Outside, the footsteps began. They were circling the house like a predator stalking its prey. Danny Caldwell had returned to claim his next victim. He would find his mother waiting with a rifle and the truth she had been too afraid to face. And he would find Tobias, ready to fight for his survival. The story continues. So as we leave Tobias on the Caldwell Ranch, facing a future he never could have predicted, we see that sometimes, even in the darkest of times, a flicker of hope can appear in the most unexpected places. This story is a testament to the enduring human spirit, the possibility of finding redemption and connection amidst hardship, and the complex ways grief can shape our choices. It reminds us that even a simple act of compassion can rewrite someone's destiny. What do you think will happen next for Tobias and Martha? What secrets do you think Martha is still hiding? Leave a comment below. I'd love to hear your theories and start a conversation. And if you enjoyed this journey, please subscribe so you don't miss out on future stories. Thanks for watching.